Hey, what's up, garden friends? Jeff here, Tropical Plant Party. How's everybody doing? Hope you're good. I'm great. Nice shot there, isn't it? Wouldn't it just suck if the entire video was like that? Nah, I'm not gonna do that. Look at what we have here. A very pretty, nice looking backlit yucca. Now, this would actually be halfway pretty if there were some clouds in the sky. This is the common houseplant yucca, known as the cane yucca. Often referred to as the cane yucca because, well, see the trunk? It's very cane-like. These are commonly sold kind of like the corn plants where there's a few trunks stuffed into a pot. Sometimes you find them just the individual plants growing in the pots, not coming out of a cut cane. There we go. That's much better. As I was saying, the cane yucca. Common house plant, also really common plant down in Florida, really the southeast in general. These are hardy all the way down to zone 8A, 8B, and these guys get massive. If you're growing this in the ground, probably not advisable to buy this as the cut cane propagated variety. Would probably be best to go ahead and get them as the actual plants growing up and out of the pots and not ones that are growing out of the sides of these cut trunks. Reason for that is that these get massive. They're actually the largest growing yucca. These can get, I think, 40 to 45 feet tall. Really big, monstrous plants. And if you have all that coming off the side of one of these canes here where it's been cut and coming off the side, then eventually that huge growth coming up with that gets, 15, 20 feet tall, that's probably going to split off of there. Indoors, they're going to grow much slower. The cane yucca is like a lot of light, though they are sometimes sold as being a low light plant. That's not necessarily the best way to grow them. However, you can just make sure you're not giving them anywhere near as much water because you'll risk them rotting. The more light, the more heat, the more they're going to grow, which means the more you're going to want to water them, the more you're going to want to fertilize them, and so on. On that note, if you buy this as a house plant, sometimes they're sold in places like IKEA in a potting medium that really is a little bit too moisture retentive for them. Often in a peat or maybe a coconut mix, something like that. I would recommend repotting them into a cactus mix. Just going to have a much easier time with them if you do that. They're very simple and easy plants to grow. Indoors, if you start to notice any browning along the sides of the leaves or on the tips, that means they need more humidity. And unfortunately, they're not like a lot of houseplants where you can just put a dish under them with some pebbles and some water and let that humidity raise up to the foliage. Well, because they're so tall. If you have one that's smaller, then that might be a viable option for you. But with something like mine, where it has these trunks on them, and this one isn't that big, they get much bigger than this, I would probably actually need to put a humidifier nearby because it's just too much distance from the ground and up to really provide adequate moisture in the air for the foliage. Sort of the opposite of it being too dry with the brown edges. If you see yellowing along the leaves that maybe aren't necessarily the ones at the very bottom of your growth, then that can often mean there's too much water. But yellowing and browning from the lower growth, sometimes that's just older foliage that you can just reach in, pull that right off, no big deal. Helps keep them looking nice and tidy. Just like a lot of houseplants, depending on the time of year is really going to be what makes the decision for how much fertilizer you give it and how often you water it. In the wintertime, if they're not getting a ton of light and your house is a little bit more on the cool side, then probably not going to want to water and fertilize this very often. That's how it is for it year round. Maybe just once or twice a year you can add a slow release fertilizer into the soil or go ahead and use a liquid one. I have mine outdoors during the summer months, so it grows very actively. And because it grows very actively, I fertilize it fairly often, about every other week actually. Once it's indoors though, that's definitely not going to be the case. In the house, I will not be fertilizing this or watering it very often at all, whereas now it's probably getting watered about every other day. In the winter months, maybe once a week. Basically, you just want to make sure that that soil dries out really well between waterings, otherwise you risk rot. And that's something nobody wants to deal with. Oh, not the hardest thing to combat with the yucca. Generally, you find the rot, make a cut above it, put some cinnamon or sulfur powder on there, something to dry that out and let it callus and repot it. Pretty simple. If you're growing this outdoors, there's some place where you can have this as a perennial. They're excellent plants as far as their salt tolerance goes. They're nowhere near as painful and dangerous as like the Yucca Elephantipes, the ones with the really sharp dagger-like leaves on them. No, these are soft. The ends of them, however, do still have a fairly sharp tip on them that can get you. But it's not like a lot of the other yuccas where the leaves are really stiff and rigid and very dangerous, really. But you still probably want to be careful on it because it can still get you. Just a really easy, high light, and low maintenance plant. Now, as a house plant, one of my favorite things about this yucca are the trunks. Especially when you can find some with some really nice bulbous thick trunks. That looks really cool. And as I had mentioned, if you have these outdoors where it's warm with good draining soil, they like a decent amount of water. But that doesn't mean that they're not drought tolerant. Once these are established, they're actually very drought tolerant. But that's in the ground. In a pot, it's not quite the same. They're going to want to be watered more frequently if they're getting a lot of light and warm temperatures. But not if they're in a moisture retentive potting mix. You don't want moisture retentive potting mixes for these guys. Like I said before, a cactus mix is just fine. That's perfect. If you can't find a cactus mix, then a general all-purpose potting soil that isn't one that's like a water-wise or water-smart, one of the ones to reduce watering, those are fine. Go ahead and add in some perlite, some sand, maybe some chunky gravel. Get that mix kind of gritty. Make sure it drains sharply. Sharply meaning that the water moves through it very quickly. In the long run, it's just far less hassle and headache to have to water it a little bit more often than to have to worry about it being drowned and rotting. As with a lot of yuccas, these are pretty easy to propagate. With mine, this has actually grown very quickly. This has probably put on a good 6 to 8 inches of trunk just this season alone. And once these trunks in here start to get much, much bigger, I'll go ahead and make a cut in here, pull this off, let it callus over a little bit, and stick it in a nice, well-draining potting mix, get it rooted. I'll have individual plants that are going to keep growing up and up and up, as opposed to something that's just growing out of the side of the trunk like this. I actually typically, personally, don't like the plants that are growing off of canes like this, kind of like the corn plants, as I mentioned before. But it's just, this one in particular, I just absolutely loved the trunk on it for some reason. Very, very thick and a little bit wonky. And that's the characteristics that drew me to this one in particular. I like the thick, wonky trunk. Okay, but that's going to do it. Quick rundown over a very, very, very common houseplant. Have y'all been growing this? Comment down below. Don't forget to leave the video a thumbs up. It helps so much. I really appreciate every single one of those. Thank you. Subscribe as well. Upload multiple times a week. I have all my social media linked down below, down there in the description. Follow me and I'll follow you back. It's a lot of fun looking at everybody's pictures, and I enjoy seeing what y'all are doing in your gardens. All right, but as always, everybody, most importantly, keep on growing. Bye-bye.